In 1952, the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista seized power in Cuba. At the time, Batista supported capitalists, and much of Cuba's economy was relying on foreign investment from America and other larger countries. Cuba had high inequality, poverty, and unemployment because their economy relied on single export of sugar. In 1953, a year after Batista seized power, a man named Fidel Castro began organizing people in order to start a communist revolution. Through guerrilla warfare, Castro and his fighters would attack Batista's forces. In 1955, Castro met Che Guevara, who was known as a revolutionary and a great guerrilla commander, and took him back to Cuba to fight for his revolution. In 1959, they were finally able to overthrow Batista's regime and began to implement their own socialist system. Their goals were threefold. First, they wanted to implement a moral and spiritual form of socialism that differed from the Soviet Union's economic-based socialism. Second, they wanted to become independent from periphery countries or countries that were richer than them and mightier than them, for example, the United States. And finally, by doing all of this, they thought they could achieve full communism. In order to achieve a moral, socialist society, they believed that the Cuban people had to gain a new consciousness. This new consciousness was one that allowed them to focus on the moral incentives of contributing to society rather than the material ones. Che Guevara thought that this had to be done through re-education and mobilization of the masses. He believed that once a few people started to think this way, then soon others would feel an internal and external pressure that pushed them and made them want to be on the same page as these other people. Once all the people in Cuba had been re-educated and had now gained this new consciousness, Castro and Che thought that socialism could be successful in Cuba. Che and Castro thought that the United States was an imperial power that sucked the wealth out of Cuba and kept it for themselves. Also, they thought that Batista was easily corrupted by the United States, which could be done because the United States was the number one importer of Cuban sugarcane at the time. For these reasons, they wanted to end that abusive relationship. They also didn't want to become reliant on the Soviet Union either. Che especially felt this way, and according to Juan Blanco, a Cuban Communist Party member, Che thought that the Soviet Union was obsessed with the economic construction of socialism and disregarded the moral and spiritual factors of it. However, by only 1991, 32 years after the initial revolution, it was clear that these goals were not obtainable and that the original wishes of the revolutionaries had not been obtained. One reason they failed to achieve their goals was because they rushed implementation of policies. For example, the elimination of material incentives for factory workers began only a few years after the revolution in 1959. At the same time, the policies meant to mobilize the masses and create that new consciousness were being drawn out over a long period of time. The masses had not yet gained that consciousness which Che believed was necessary for success. Another reason for failure was Cuba's lack of diversity and development in their economy. One example of this is in 1970, when there was a collective effort to harvest 10 million tons of sugar. Ultimately, they were only able to cultivate 8.5 tons, and more importantly, the rest of the economy took massive damage during this time due to a lack of focus on other sectors. These sectors crashed and the economy was in rough shape. Because of these issues in Cuba with their economy, they started to become more reliant on help from the Soviet Union. And they also started implementing economic policies that were unique to the Soviet Union as well. By 1990, 85% of Cuba's imports came from the Soviet Union. So next year, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba was hurled into its biggest economic crisis yet, and has still yet to get out of that crisis.